Hey folks, Nathan here. Welcome to Nate's Favorite Deck Building Games. This time, as promised, we take a look at the brand new expansion for Shards of Infinity entitled Relics of the Future. Now, I mentioned before when talking about Shards of Infinity that it's a relatively inexpensive game and the box is kind of everything that you need. There's no board unless you go out to a convention and you actually pick up a playmat. It's a relatively compact game in terms of the amount of material you get, but also it does mean that it has a relatively reasonable price most of the time depending on where you buy it. Now, its expansion is of the same vein. It is a $10 expansion, so not a whole lot to it. There's only 32 cards in this expansion. And I wanted to put these side by side to give you a sense here, along with a card, of the sizes that we're looking at. Because I know that there were some folks who have gotten their Relics of the Future and are kind of taken aback by how small it is. It's because it's only 32 cards for a game that in and of itself was also relatively small. In fact, really the only reason that the box for Shards of Infinity needs to be as big as it is for the main character cards here. So just know that going into it, it's a relatively inexpensive expansion to a relatively inexpensive game, both of which are fun, but it's going to mean that it's going to be a relatively small package, so don't freak out when you see it as something fairly tiny. Now, as far as what you get for this expansion here, we do have expanded rules, but these are specific to the expansion and new ways of playing the original game. So you do need the original game's instructions to play, and of course you do need the original game to play with this expansion. This is not a standalone in the way that the same company, Stoneblade Entertainment, deals with Ascension. You cannot play just Relics of the Future in this case. Now, as far as what you get inside the box card-wise, we have a total of 28 new cards that are going to go into our center deck to eventually go into our oddly named center row that is 2x3, and they essentially play the same way as what we've seen before, with one exception, and that is that every once in a while you will run across a card that is specific to which character you are playing as that oversized card, like Decima here, where you're going to track your health and your mastery. Again, we talked last time in the Shards of Infinity episodes about how it really doesn't matter which of these characters you're playing as, because they all have the same focus ability, pay 1 gem, then exhaust to gain 1 mastery. They start out with the same health, and the amount of mastery you start with is determined by turn order, not by anything about your particular character. So other than just the look of them, there really wasn't anything to make it unusual or different to play as one versus another. Now at least there are a few cards that have minor benefits coming from which of those characters you're playing as. But there's 28 of these that are going to go into our center deck. And then the other 8 cards we get to go along with those 24, those are something new referred to as relics. You may recall that I mentioned back in that previous episode how the whole interchangeability of these characters is what Relics of the Future was really being designed to address. It was something that they wanted to do within the original game. They wanted each of these characters to feel a little bit different as you played with them, so your choice of character might actually make a difference in the game. But they couldn't quite figure out how they wanted to balance out the characters and whatnot before the release of the original version of the game, so instead they just put out the regular starter set that has no difference between those characters. And Relics of the Future was going to introduce those relics, which is what we're going to talk about now, that actually does start to make a difference. So the idea is that you have chosen your characters to start with. So what you have then alongside those 24 black bordered cards for the center row are these 8 relic cards that are silver, or you might call them gray bordered, which are designed, just like with Ascension, anytime you see that color border, to not go in the center row, but to be set aside for something else. In this case, each of these characters now has 2 relic cards that are specific to their faction, so whatever faction they're supposed to lead. For instance, Ko Sin Woo, he leads the Wreath faction, so we have 2 Wreath relics, in this case both ally type, okay, in ally versus champion, that sort of thing. And what'll happen is that as you play, you'll have these 2 kind of set aside over on your side of the table, depending on which of these characters you chose to start with. And when you hit a mastery threshold of 10, when this counter reaches 10, then kind of like getting a mastery threshold bonus on other cards, or in this case, like hitting 20 on this specific card here, when you hit 10, they have this unique mastery cost up here, mastery threshold indicator up here, as opposed to a gem cost or anything like that. As soon as you hit that, you're able to choose one of those two, get it, because they have the same cost, get it, stick it in your discard pile, and then it's in your deck for play as a fairly powerful card throughout the rest of the game. And typically they're going to have a mastery threshold bonus of 20 on the card as well, and of course when you hit 30, that's when you have the maximum, and the next time that you wind up with your Infinity Shard coming up, you can basically just tear everybody up. So what are these cards? Because they do make a difference here. We have the Heart of Nothing for Wreath. Okay. We have the World Piercer, also for Wreath. You can only gain one of these per game. As soon as you gain one of the two, and you do get to choose, the other one is just gone. It is out of play for the entire game. Then for the Order, right, for Tetra, we have Terminal Crescents. Then we have Datic Robes. Then for Decima, we have Praetorian 01, Praetorian 02. No, these are not upgrading one to the other. It's just two to choose from. Okay. And then for Volos, we have Entropic Talons, or Entropic? Yeah, whatever. Talons, Entropy, right? And then Panconscious Crown. Now you might say that's pretty small for an expansion unless we're talking about a crossover pack for the DC deck building game. So is there anything else we get with this? Well, the other things you actually get come in the form of gameplay variants and new rules as opposed to new physical items. And they're all laid out on that instruction foldout. I don't even call it an instruction booklet. So of new gameplay variants that it describes, there are some pretty cool ones and some that are pretty standard. One of those gameplay variants is what you would expect, probably 2-on-2 battles, or 2v2. So instead of it being that everyone is fighting for just themselves, trying to take out every other character, you have teams of 2. Not a big shock there. Then we have the 3-player Bloodbath. Then let's say I'm Decima. If I have 5 power and I'm going to attack one of the other characters, it doesn't matter which one I aim at, because the Bloodbath part of the name refers to the fact that whatever damage I deal gets damage to all of the other characters. Everybody gets hit for the same amount. So essentially the game moves more quickly. There's also the idea of, well, wait a second. If we play a game like this now, where the relics do make a difference in terms of character choice, then shouldn't we have some way of figuring out who gets to choose characters first, or are they all random? Well, one way they suggest doing it is the so-called health auction. You have everything set up, and then you have your 4 players sitting there, presumably it's all 4, let's say, and you basically go around and bid how much health you are willing to lose to start with before the game even begins in order to have first choice. So I may say, well, I'll bid 1 health. Next person says, okay, well, 2. Next person says 3. Next person says 4. And it goes around and around until everybody has said, you know what, that's too rich for my blood, I'm out. And there's only one person left. They dock themselves as much health as their final bid was, but they now get to choose which of these characters they want. And then you do it again and again to get the next 2 choices, and the person that's just left with the one that nobody else chose starts out with the full 50 health. They call it the health auction mode. Along similar lines, you could just disassociate the relics from the particular characters. I mean, technically the only thing tying them is their color scheme / faction, right? So in theory, you can put all 8 of the relics together, and then for each of the individual players in the game, let's say it's a 4-player game, right? For each player, you take 2 face-up relics and deal them out into the center of the table, essentially. So in this case, if it's 4 players, it's 8, okay? And then you randomly determine which player begins this so-called relic draft. And as you'd expect for any kind of draft, that first player then gets to pick one, then the next player picks one, next player picks one, next player picks one, and then it keeps going around until all the relics have been taken, and those wind up being the 2 that you're able to choose from when you reach that mastery level of 10. However, there is the added twist that whoever was the last person to get to choose in that first round of the draft, they wind up getting to go first as the first turn in the game. Then there's also the mystery relics version of that kind of thing, where basically you just take all the relics, you shuffle them together face down, you deal them out evenly to each player, as best as possible, right, given the fact that you have 8, so an even number to each player. Now, the rules say players should keep these relics secret until you hit Mastery level 10, check them both out, or however many you have out. Maximum will be 2 at this point, just because of the number of cards that we have, and you pick one of them, that becomes the one that you have acquired. As in the regular game, the other one just goes out of play. One of the cooler additions, though, that you get with Relics of the Future are rules for a single-player Nemesis challenge, as it's called. Basically, you play solo and you face off against another character that takes the role of the Nemesis. And after each of your turns, the Nemesis takes a turn, but they don't actually start with a deck and gain cards the normal way, and essentially you win by reducing their health down to 0. You start out with your regular starting deck, but you also add an additional 11th card to that starting deck, and which one just depends on which of the characters you happen to have chosen. So you win by reducing its health to 0, whereas the Nemesis wins through sort of this automated gameplay. The rules are all on that sheet, but through this automated gameplay, they're attacking you, they're trying to take you down, and once your health is down to 0, or the Nemesis reaches mastery level of 30, or you need to refill the center row but there aren't enough cards to do so, any of those conditions, you lose. So it's another of these sort of fighting against the game modes, kind of like the way that Legendary works, only specific to single player, to solo play, as we see in some other deck building games. So is there a lot to Relics of the Future? Not really. It introduces some interesting new mechanics and new game modes. I think you could very easily make the case that the Relic cards, these extra cards, which are nice at least, and all these different gameplay variant rules probably could have and maybe should have been inside the original base game, even if it slightly raised the cost of it. But it is what it is. We got the game. What we get within Relics of the Future is worthwhile if you play it, and it really, at only $10 is not a big investment. Just understand that what you're getting primarily are a very small handful of cards, one major new mechanic, and some new game rules to explain how to play different modes, but nothing that actually is required to play those modes except for the Relic cards, depending on if you're using some of those Relic-based variants that I pointed out. Enjoyable. I'm digging it. But at the same time, I do kind of wish these were part of the original package.